Hi and welcome to the JavaScript course. I'm Lourenço Gomes, your instructor, and what you are seeing right in front of you is the project that we are going to build together during the course. Let me quickly show you each of the components that we are going to be working on. So starting from the top, we have this menu that we can open and close. And in order to do this, we are going to use events. So we are going to monitor a click event on this button and also on this one. And when those events occur, we are going to do CSS manipulation. So we are going to change the class of this menu to make it show. And when we click the close button, we are going to remove that class to make it disappear again. Then we are going to move to this greeting section. We are going to use conditionals here so we can decide if we say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the time of day. Then we have this weather text, which first identifies the location of the user. So we are going to use a native JavaScript method to get the user location. And then we're going to send an HTTP request to an API called Open Weather Map to get the real-time weather information and form this message. With all the information we need, we are going to use string interpolation to do this message. Right under it, we have this button where we can change from Celsius to Fahrenheit. And to make this work, we are going to create our own temperature conversion function that will be executed when we click this button. Then on the right side, we have this working clock with the local time. In order to make this work, we are going to use the JavaScript built-in date and time methods. Now scrolling down, we have this image gallery with the thumbnails. To make this work, we are going to have all the images in a list. This is a JavaScript data type called arrays. And we are going to loop through the array so we can form these thumbnails. And to make the functionality of changing the image, we are going to use again the click event so we know when the thumbnails are clicked. If we inspect this element, we can see that the thumbnails, they have specific attributes at the HTML level, and we are going to interact with these attributes in order to show the correct image in large. Now scrolling down, here we have this product section. Let me show you how we are going to receive the products. So we are going to have an array that looks like this. So it's an array with objects. Each object is going to be each product. So we are going to have multiple properties for each product. And we are going to use these properties to show them correctly like this. This is going to be a lot of fun and super useful. And also we have this filter up here in which we can click to show only paid or free products. So this seems to be a lot of things to do, but I'm pretty sure that you are going to finish this project without any problems. And while we progress solving all these challenges, you are going to learn all the fundamentals of JavaScript. In the description of this video, I left a link for the Git repo so you can download the project files. If you're familiar with Git, you can just go ahead and clone the repo. If you don't know how to use Git, you can click on Code and then select Download Zip so you can download the files on your computer. Once you do that, you can just open the code editor of your preference. In this course, we are going to be using Visual Studio Code. Once you open Visual Studio Code, just go to File, Open Folder. Then go to the folder you just downloaded, select it, and click Open. Here you will find the HTML and CSS files plus the assets, which includes all the images used in this project. To open the project in the web browser, you can just go to the folder you just downloaded. And if you double click the HTML file, you will see the project in the browser. This is a static version with only HTML and CSS, so we can get started with JavaScript and do all the dynamic parts of this page together. Now, one thing I'd like to show you before we get started is the live server extension, which is going to make it easier for you to see the changes in the project. So instead of going to the folder and double clicking the HTML file, I suggest you go to the extensions section of Visual Studio Code and search for the live server extension. There are some extensions with the same name, so make sure you download the one from the same author. Once you do it, you will probably have to close Visual Studio Code and open it again for the extension to be enabled. Once it is enabled, you will see this Go Live button at the bottom right of your screen. Just click on it and you will open the project in the browser. The difference here, if you see the address bar, this is now a local server, and the advantage of doing this is that every change we do is going to be automatically updated in the web browser. We won't have to keep refreshing the browser. So I'm just going to show you one example. If we go to the HTML file, I'm going to change this to good afternoon. I'm going to press Ctrl S to save it. And once I go back to the browser, you can see that it's already updated. We don't have to press F5. So like this, we can see our changes much faster. Now that I have it open on Google Chrome, this is the version I'm going to be using from now on. We are going to be pressing Alt-Tab or Command-Tab on Mac to be switching from Visual Studio Code and the web browser. So we are going to be implementing things in our code, changing things, and then we press Alt-Tab or Command-Tab to go back to the browser and see the changes in the web browser. Remember that Google Chrome and other web browsers have something called the JavaScript engine. So these browsers are ready to read and execute JavaScript code. So how do we write JavaScript code in our page? Before we go to our HTML file, we need to open the developer tools in the browser. You can use the F12 shortcut, or you can just right-click the page and go to Inspect. This is going to open the developer tools. This is extremely important for us developers because here we have all the information we need to work with our page. The Elements tab shows all the HTML elements, and this is going to be important because here we can see the names of the elements, the IDs, classes, and this is the information we are going to use to interact with these elements using JavaScript. If you go to the Console tab, this is the most important one for the JavaScript part. Here, if there are any errors with our JavaScript code, they are going to show in the console. Right now, we don't have any errors because we don't have any JavaScript code written. But we can see this symbol, which means that the interpreter is ready to read and execute JavaScript code. In fact, if we type JavaScript code here, we can execute it directly in our page. For example, if we type a math operation, which is something that JavaScript does, we're going to see the results below. So we can type 2 plus 3, and the JavaScript engine is going to do the calculation for us. We can also type JavaScript functions. For example, we can write alert, which is the name of a JavaScript function. Then we open parentheses, and inside quotation marks, we can write a message. So we can type, for example, test, close quotation marks, close parentheses. Don't worry about this syntax right now because we are going to speak more about why we need to use parentheses and quotation marks. So if we type this and press enter, the JavaScript engine is going to execute this function. And what this function does is showing this message modal in which we can see the message we just sent between quotation marks, and we can click OK to close it. Remember that JavaScript is a case-sensitive language, which means that if the name of this function is all lowercase, we cannot type with any uppercase letter. So for example, if we try the alert with the first letter as uppercase, let's try to do the same thing we did before. Now let's try to execute it. As you can see, now we have an error. It's telling us that alert is not defined. And this happened because JavaScript is case sensitive. So the alert function is written with all lowercase. This is the type of errors that we are going to see here if we type incorrect JavaScript code in our JavaScript file. Now, everything we do in the console is only for test purposes. So we are going to use the console to watch for errors in our code. We can also use it to do some tests like we did here if we want to test out JavaScript functions. But remember that every time you refresh your page, everything you do here will go away. So this is not where we're going to type JavaScript code. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and here we have our HTML file. I'm going to close the side tab so we have a better view of the code. So here we have the head section of our HTML file. We have the body section, and the way we write JavaScript code in the page is by adding script tags. And the most recommended place to include the script tags is in the end of the body element. So let's go all the way to the end of the HTML file where we close the body. So here we can see the closure of the body element. So right here, I'm going to add a script tag. I can just do it like this, and if I type JavaScript code here, it is going to be executed by the browser. So let's do the same test. Let's try the alert function. Open and close quotation marks. Let's type something like test JavaScript code. And this is a statement. So we just typed one line of JavaScript code or one statement, which is an instruction for the browser to execute. And when we finish a statement, we end it with the semicolon. This is telling the JavaScript engine that we just finished this statement. So we can type more statements in the same line, but the most recommended thing is to break a line and write more statements. For now, let's just use this one and let's see what happens. I'm going to press Ctrl S. And once we go back to the page, you can see that the code is being executed when the page loads. We can click OK, and then the page will load normally. If we refresh the page, it is going to run again every time we do it. And the reason for this is that every time we open this in the web browser, the JavaScript engine is going to read everything we type inside the script tag, and it is going to execute each statement line by line. So once we load the page, it's going to read this statement and execute it right away. So now this is saved. Every time we load the page, our scripts are going to be executed. Now, even though this works, this is not the most recommended way of writing JavaScript. This is because, like this, our JavaScript code is going to be mixed with the HTML code. This is going to be very confusing. So the same way we separate CSS like this, so we have all the styles of our page separated from the HTML, we're going to do the same thing with JavaScript. So we can click the New File button, and I'm going to create a new file called main.js. So .js is the extension we need to use to write JavaScript code. Once we have this file, we can just go to the index.html, and we are going to use a script again. But instead of writing JavaScript code inside, what we are going to do is type script, and then we are going to choose this one with a source. And right here, we are going to create a link to the main.js file. We can save this, and now every time we load our page, once we hit this part of the code, the browser will get all the content of the main.js file and execute the statements line by line. So let's make a test here. Let's create another alert function here. So let's type something different like test JavaScript code from an external file. We can save. And once we go back to the browser, we can see that the JavaScript code is being executed correctly. It's important that we do these steps before we start working on the actual functionalities of our page, because now we are making sure that the browser is reading the file correctly and executing the code we write. If you don't see this message, probably there's something wrong with the link. Maybe the name of the file is not correct, or the path, in case you create it on a separate folder. So make sure you write an alert function and you see it being executed in the browser. If you do that, you are ready to move on. So we just executed our first statement. If you want to write more JavaScript lines, you can just use the semicolon and you are ready to write more JavaScript code. Just one thing to make it clear is that the semicolons are not mandatory. So if we don't use them and just break the line and write more JavaScript code, it is going to work without any problems. But I think it's a good practice to use the semicolons so we know for sure when we are done with a statement. In the previous lesson, we learned how to execute JavaScript code in our page. Now we're going to dive deeper into the JavaScript syntax, which are the rules that define how we should write JavaScript code. The first important thing to understand is why we had to use parentheses. So we use parentheses because the alert is a function. There's something in JavaScript called functions and methods, which are blocks of code that we can create and give them a name so we can execute them later. JavaScript has some built-in functions, and one example is the alert function. We can also create our own functions. So I'm going to create one real quick just so we use as an example, but later in the course, we're going to have a dedicated lesson about functions. But to create a function, I would use the function keyword, and I can give it a name. For example, I can name this function test alert. Remember that JavaScript is case sensitive, so when I execute this function later, I need to type it exactly the way I did here. So with all lowercase except for this letter, which is uppercase. When you are creating functions, you can't use names that are already used by the JavaScript built-in functions. So for example, we can't create our own function called alert because this function already exists. We also can't use reserved words. So for example, function is a reserved word that's used to create a function. So we cannot create a function with this name. Now test alert is a new name. There's no built-in JavaScript function with this name. So we can use it for our custom function. Then we open and close parentheses, and inside them is where we're going to place the arguments for this function. For this first test, let's make this function without any arguments. We still need the open and closing parentheses. We just leave it blank in this case. Now we're going to open and close curly braces. Now it's a good practice to break some lines, so we write the content of our function inside here. So every time you see open and closing curly braces in JavaScript, this means this is a block of code. In this case, this is the block of code that is going to be executed every time we invoke this function. So we can type many different things here that will be executed when we call this function. For example, we can get this alert statement and we can write it inside here. We can also write more statements, and once this function is executed, all these lines of code will be executed. So we can type something like test1, test2, and we just created our first function. So remember, function is the keyword that we need to use to start a function, followed by the name of the function, which has to be a unique name. It can't be a name already used by JavaScript. Then open and close parentheses. Here is where we're going to place arguments. I'm going to show you an example with an argument in a second. And inside curly braces is where we are going to type the code that is going to be executed by this function. Now, if we save this and go back to the page, nothing is going to happen yet. This is because we just created the function. Now, if we want to execute this code, we need to execute the function. And the way we do this is by using the name we just created and open and close parentheses to execute the function. So this is why we were using parentheses in the alert function. Every time we want to execute a method or a function, we are going to have to use the open and close parentheses. Here, we can use the semicolon to end this statement. And once we do this, we can save this and go back to the web browser. And when we refresh the page, we see the test 1, we click OK. And now we see the test 2, we click OK, and then the page finishes loading. Now that we have created this function, we can execute it anytime we want in the code. So this is a good way of storing a piece of code or a sequence of statements that can be executed anytime you need to execute them. So this is our custom-made function. We just created it, and JavaScript also has the built-in functions, like the alert function we used in the previous lesson. Now, in the beginning of this lesson, I spoke about the parentheses. So when we create functions, we can pass arguments. And arguments are useful so we make the function dynamic. Right now, this function is static because every time we execute it, it is just going to send test 1 and then test 2. But if we want to make this dynamic, we can create an argument. And the argument can be, for example, a message. And now, instead of sending this text, we can send a message. And now, how do we define what message is this? Every time we execute the function, we can pass any message we want. And the reason why we use quotation marks for that is because we are sending text. Every time we work with text in JavaScript, which is a data type called string, we have to use the quotation marks. So here we can send test 1, 2, 3. We can save this. And when we load the page, we can see the message right here. And now our function is dynamic. We can use the same function to send different messages. So we can try this one, and then we can send the message for the function. Let's do 4, 5, 6. And we don't have to change the function. We can just change the argument that we are passing to this function. So when we go back there, now we have 1, 2, 3, and we also have 4, 5, 6. Now, if we want to do math operations, we can also do that. For example, we can do 4 plus 5 as the argument of this function. We click save, we go back there. Now we see test 1, 2, 3, and we see 9. This is because JavaScript can do math operations. So we are adding 4 and 5, which is 9. And then when we enter the function, JavaScript is sending the result of that math operation through the alert function. So remember that when we were in the console, we could type the operations directly here, like 4 plus 5, and we would see the result below. But right here, if we just type 4 plus 5, we're not going to see anything, because even though JavaScript will do the calculation, we need to tell JavaScript where do we want to show this. So one place that we can show this is in an alert box. We can also send it to HTML elements, which is something that we are going to do later in the course. And there is also one important function, which is called console.log. And the dot, that is a new thing that we are seeing right here, will also be clear to you when we speak about the objects. So an object is a data type in JavaScript, and objects can have methods, which are the same thing as functions. So the console object has a method called log, which works exactly as a function, which means that we can pass any message we want as an argument. So let's send some text. We can also send math operations, which in this case won't need the quotation marks. But if we want to send a piece of text, we need to use the quotation marks, which by the way can also be single quotation marks like this. This is going to work exactly the same way. So let's send test message to the console. So right now we don't need our function anymore. I'm going to delete it from here. I was just making a test to show you how you create a function. Now we're going to use another built-in function, which is the console.log function, and let's see what this function does. I'm going to save this, and when I go back to the page, you can see that now we don't have any alert because this function does not show an alert box. What this function does is sending something to the console. So this is extremely useful for us developers to send stuff to the console so we understand what's going on with our JavaScript code. This is not for the user to see, this is only for us developers, and during the course you will see that we are going to use the console a lot so we know the values that we are working with. Now again, going back there, if we want to send a math operation to the console, we can just do 4 plus 5, save this, and when we go back there, we see the results showing in the console. So this is something important. Every time you have a value, a message, or the result of a calculation in JavaScript, you need to decide where do you want to send this. So we can send an alert box, we can send it to the console, and even more importantly, we're going to send these values to our HTML elements. And this is what is going to make our page dynamic. For example, when we do this local time element, we are going to get the current hour and send this value right here. Then the same thing for the minutes and same thing for the seconds. So this is how we are going to do stuff with JavaScript and show them on the page. In the previous lessons, we learned how to execute JavaScript code. We learned a little bit about functions, about the built-in functions, about how to create our own functions. We know that to execute a function, we need to call it by the name, which is case sensitive. Then we need to open and close parentheses to both create functions and also to execute them. And inside here, we pass arguments. So now that we know these things, let's see how we can start interacting with the elements of our page. Now things are going to start getting interesting because we will be able to actually make our page dynamic. For that, we need to speak about the document object model. So let's go back to the browser so we see something. So when we refresh the page, as I've showed you, there's this elements tab where we can see all the HTML elements of our page. Every time we load the page, the browser creates an object, a JavaScript object that will contain something called the document object model. And this is an object that contains all the HTML elements of our page. It looks more or less like this. So this is the main object called document in lowercase. And then we have something that it's called the DOM tree. So we have this structure that looks like a tree and branches. And then we have sub branches. And these are the HTML elements. So if you notice on the HTML file, you will see that the top level elements are the head and the body element. If we go back to Visual Studio Code and we go to the HTML file and we close the head and close the body, we can see that the direct children of the HTML elements are the head and the body. And this is exactly what is being shown in this image. So we have the HTML, then the direct children are the head and the body element. Inside the head, we have some elements like the title and other elements, and inside each element we have content. So in this case, we have a title and some text inside. If we go back there to check that, let's open the head. We have the title, and inside the title we have some content. This is what is being represented in the image as text. Then we have the body element, and this element has children as well. So it can have multiple HTML elements, and here we just have some examples, like it can have a P element for paragraph, and inside this P element there will be some content, in this case some text. And same for ULs. So for example, if we have an unordered list, there will be a node for the unordered list. By the way, all of these blue boxes are nodes of our HTML structure. So this is one node, this is another node. So inside the UL, we have 3 nodes for the list items, and inside each of them, we have content. So the way we are going to interact with the HTML elements of our page is by calling the document object. So just to remind you, every time we load a page, the browser will read the HTML file and it is going to create this JavaScript object that we can interact with. If you want to learn more about this subject, I suggest you go to Google and type JavaScript document object model. W3 Schools is one of the websites I like the most to teach basic programming concepts. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all their tutorials about these subjects are very good. They are simple to understand and they have a lot of examples. So you can just click here and you have a more detailed explanation about the DOM. And if you keep exploring it further, you will see methods and elements and a lot of things that we are going to cover in the course as well. Let's open the console so we can make some tests with the DOM, and then we can apply what we learned in our JavaScript file. Right here, we know we can access the JavaScript objects that we have at our disposal, and we just learned that when the page loads, the browser will create a JavaScript object called document. Remember that it should be in lowercase because JavaScript is case sensitive. So if we type document in lowercase, we will see that we have something here. If we press enter, it is going to give us the content of this document object. And as you can see, this is the exact HTML content of our page. But this is not what's interesting. What's interesting about this is the methods that we can use to select specific elements. So for example, let me just select one here. So we see its structure, like the ID, classes, and all that. This is going to be important because this is how we're going to identify elements so we can select them. So we can see that this age 1 has an ID of greeting. And since IDs are unique, we can use it to select this specific element. So if we type document, and then we use a method that is available with this object that it's called get element by ID. Now be careful with the capital letters. So it starts with lowercase and then the first letter of all subsequent words, they start with uppercase. So here we have elements with E in uppercase, by it's uppercase, and ID is also uppercase. So this is the name of a method that will select a specific element by the ID. And now is where we're going to start using arguments. So for this function, what we need to pass inside parentheses is the ID of the elements we're trying to select. Since this is a text, we are going to pass between quotation marks. Remember that it can be double quotation marks like this. So let's remember that the ID of that element is greeting. So we can use double quotation marks or single quotation marks. It doesn't make any difference. And now if we just press enter, we can see that we successfully selected that specific element. But this is not very useful yet. Now that we selected it, we need to be able to do something with it. So again, let's type the same thing, but let's not stop here. Let's add more methods. So here we can add another dot and we can add another method. This structure of adding dots to keep doing things with an element is something that is going to become intuitive to you once we progress. So this first part of the code selected the element we want. And now we are going to get this element and we are going to apply a method in this element. And the method we are going to apply is going to be the inner HTML. Again, be careful with the capital letters. In this case, inner is all lowercase and then we have HTML all in uppercase. And this is where we are going to use the equal sign for the first time. We use the equal sign to assign values to variables or to HTML elements. So in this case, we're telling the browser to select this element and change its inner HTML to something. And in order to assign a value to something, we use the equal sign. And then we can pass the value that we want to add to that element. So right here, we can maybe change this to the famous hello world. We are done with this statement, so we can use the semicolon. Remember that this is optional, but I think it's a good practice to always use it. And once we press enter, just pay attention to what's gonna happen to this element here. Once we press enter, we can see that now the text changed. So this is how we interact with elements on our page. And this is how we're going to be able to do everything that we have to do in this project. We are going to select elements and we are going to manipulate their content. Remember that what we did here is just for testing purposes. If we refresh the page, nothing that we did here will be saved. So if you want to do the same thing in Visual Studio Code, you can just go to the main.js file and let's type the same thing here just to test. So document.get element by ID. I suggest you always use the hints that you have on Visual Studio Code so you don't have to type everything. You just type get and then you can choose the method you want. So get element by ID. The element we're looking for has an ID of greeting. And once we select this element, we want to change its inner HTML. So inner HTML, we're going to assign a value to it. In this case, it's going to be the hello world. Semicolon to finish the statement. Let's save this. Once we go back to the page, we can see that now every time it loads, it is going to replace the content. So we can refresh the page and this is going to be the content for this element. Even though we have something different in the HTML file, once we load the page, the browser will read the JavaScript file and will execute our statements. In this case, it is replacing the content of that element. Of course, this is just an example. This is not what we want to do, but now we know how to select elements and change their content. So we are ready to move forward with our project. In the previous lesson, we learned how to use methods of the document object to select and interact with HTML elements. Before we move ahead, I just want to speak about some other methods for selecting elements. So if we press arrow up in the console, we can see the previous comments that we typed here. So this is what we typed in the previous lesson. We use the method getElementById, and then we pass the ID of the element we wanted to select, and then we change the inner HTML property to hello world. And when we do this and press enter, we can change the content of that element. So this is one method for selecting elements. If you type document.getElement, you will see a list of the available methods that you have starting with these letters. So as you can see, you can select elements by class name, by name, by tag name. So let's use the class name for example. And before we type anything, let's go to elements just so we can see the structure of our page. Let's try to select, for example, all these items because most likely they will have the same class. So if we select this element, we can see that this is a product and it has a class of product item. Let me just copy this. If I collapse this element, we can see that the next one has the same class and the next one also have the same class. So if we wanted to select all of them, we could select them by class. So going back to the console, let's use getElementsByClassName. Again, be careful with the capital letters, and also in this case, notice that it's not element ending with a T, but elements ending with an S, because this one is going to select more than one element. Since the ID is unique, this one selects only one element at a time, but this method selects more. So here it's elements ending with an S by class name. To make sure you don't make mistakes with the capital letters, the best thing is to start typing and then selecting the correct method from the list. So right here, we can pass the class that we want. Remember that it can be double quotation marks or single quotation marks. It doesn't make any difference. So in this case, we are going to select all items with a class of product item. If we do this, we can see that this time it is returning an HTML collection. And this is because we have 3 items with the same class. And this is the structure of an array. An array is a data type in JavaScript, and we are going to learn about it later. So basically what this is a collection of elements. In this case, there's a length. So we have 3 elements that were returned, and each of them has an index, and the indexes starts with 0. So the first element has an index of 0, and if we hover over, we can see which element is this. Then we have the second element, then we have the third element. This way of structuring data is super useful because then we will be able to do whatever we want with the 3 of them or with each of them separately. We are going to have full control of what we want to do with these elements. Now, one thing to pay attention here is that when we have a collection instead of a single element, there are things that we can't do. So for example, if we select all the elements by class name, we can't apply the inner HTML method. If we try to do that, let's try to change the inner HTML of all of them to test, for example. Then we press enter. We can see that there's no error here, but we weren't able to change the inner HTML of them. This is because when we have a collection like this, we're going to have to use a loop. So we run through each of these elements in order to do things with them. This is a subject for a more advanced lesson, so we are not going to cover this right now. I just wanted to show you that you can select multiple elements. In that case, you are going to have an HTML collection, and later in the course, you will learn how you can interact with these elements by using loops. So this is another way of selecting elements by class name. We can also select elements by tag name. So in this case, we're going to use a method called getElementsByTagName. So if we want to select, for example, all the P elements of our page, all the paragraphs, we can use this method, and then inside quotation marks, we type the name of the tag. In this case, it's the P tag that we want to select. And if we do this, we can see that we are going to have an HTML collection composed of 15 elements, which means that we have 15 P elements on our page. If we hover over them, we can see what are the P elements of our page. And if we open them here, we can see more information about them. This will seem a bit overwhelming right now, but as we progress, you will see that these properties can be very useful, so we interact with these elements. So this is another way of selecting elements by using the tag name. Before we finish, the last one that I want to show you is the query selector method. This is easier, first because it's shorter to write, and also because we can actually use CSS selectors, which is something that we are used to do while typing HTML and CSS, and we can use it in JavaScript as well. So if you want to select, for example, an element with a specific ID, we can use document dot, and then let's use the query selector method. And right here, we can just type any CSS selector. So for example, if we want to select only the P that has an ID of weather, we can just type CSS selector. So P with an ID of weather. If we do this, we can select only that element. In this case, this is the P that we just selected. And in this case, since we have only one element being returned, again, we can alter the inner HTML property. So in this case, we have inner HTML, and we are going to assign some value to it. So let's type something like new value. We press enter, and now we were able to change the content of this element. So this is just another way of selecting HTML elements. And this is going to be the method I'm going to use most of the times in our project. In the previous lessons, we learned some different methods to select HTML elements and how to use the inner HTML property to change their content. Now we're going to speak about CSS manipulation so we can change their styles and manipulate their classes. Once we learn how to do that, we can start working on our project, and the first thing we are going to work on here is this menu that we can click to open and click to close. What this is doing is just adding and removing a class. So when we click the button, we add a specific class that makes the element show. When we click the close button, we remove that class and then the element disappears. This is super exciting. So let's go back to the initial version so we learn how to work with CSS. So we are going to start selecting elements the same way. Before, we had the document.query selector to select a specific item, and we were changing the content of the inner HTML property. Now we are going to do something a bit different. Instead of changing the inner HTML property, we are going to work with a property called style. And this is the property where all styles of each element are saved. Inside this property, we have one property for all the CSS selectors. So for example, if we want to change the color of the text, we can just do style.color, and then we can add the same value we would add in the CSS file. We can type a color name, for example, red. If we do this, we just changed the color of this text to red. So we selected it first, and then we access the style property. Inside this property, we have one property for each CSS property. So if we want to change the color, we can just do .color and then assign a different value. You can also use RGB, you can use X codes. Again, the same thing you can type in CSS, you can type via JavaScript. So if we use something like DE, 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 this is an X code, and then we just change the color property to this value. We can't see the difference much because this is a gray that it's very similar to the original color of the text, but if we select this element, and then we go to the CSS right here, we can see that this color has this RGB code that if we change to X, we can see that it's DE, 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 which we just defined using JavaScript. So let's go back to the console. Now, any CSS property, so let's go back to our CSS file. Let me open the project. Let's go to main.css. So every property that we set here, for example, margin, padding, height, everything we can do in CSS, we can do through the style property. So if we want to change the margin, we can just go here, do the same thing and do style dot margin, and then we can set it to something like 100 pixels. If we do this, now we just added a lot of margin to this element. We just added 100 pixels to all the sides of the element. And the same thing is going to happen for all other properties. Just one thing that you have to keep in mind is that for the properties that have a dash, we're going to have to name them a bit differently. And this is because we can't use dashes on names of properties. This is something that we're going to speak with more detail when we talk about variables. So when you have a dash like this, you need to write a bit differently. So for example, let's change the background color of that element. So we can go back there, and the name of the property is background color. So if we were to follow the same rule, we would just type it like this. But we can't type it like this because we can't use dashes on properties names. So for all the CSS property that have dashes, we are going to remove the dashes and we're going to use a capital letter for the next word. So background color is going to be written like this. Background, then capital C, and then the rest of it. And then we can do the same thing. So if we want to add a red background color to that element, we can just do this, press enter, and as you can see, we just changed the background. So this is how we change styles directly. Now, how can we add and remove classes? Let me just refresh the page so we clear all this. If we go back to our project and we create a new class, so here I'm going to create a new class called red BG. And all the elements that have this class are going to have a background color of red. Now that I have this class, how can I add it to an element? So the method of selecting the element is going to be the same, but now instead of accessing the style property, we're going to access a property called class list. And for the class list, we can either add or remove a class. So we can use the add method, so .add, and inside parentheses, inside quotation marks, we type the name of the class that we want to add to this element. So in this case, we want to add the class of red BG. We press enter, and as you can see, the background changed to red. Why is that? Let's select the element. Let's see that now it has the class of red BG, and all the elements that have this class are going to have the style we defined in the CSS file. Now, if you want to do the opposite, if you want to remove a class, then you can just use class list dot remove, and then you can remove classes from elements. There's also one that's very useful, which is called toggle, because this one, it doesn't matter if the element has the class or not. If it has, it's going to remove. If it doesn't have, it's going to add. So right here, instead of remove, let's use toggle. And now that the element doesn't have the class, if we try this, it's going to add a class. If we do it again, now the element already has it. It's going to do the opposite. It's going to remove it. So this can be very useful on some occasions because we want one behavior if an element has a class already, and a different behavior if the element doesn't have that class. So these are basically three methods we can use to add, remove, and toggle classes of an element. Now we are very close to learning what we need in order to make this work. There's only one thing that we still have to learn, which are events. Because now we can just add or remove the class we want to make the element show and disappear, but we don't want to do this when the page loads. We only want to do this when this element is clicked. So in the next lesson, we're going to speak about JavaScript events. So when there is a click on this element, then we're going to manipulate the CSS of our menu. Now that we know how to select HTML elements, how to change their content, how to change their styles, how to manipulate their classes, we still need to speak about events in order to make our page interactive. This is because we don't want to do these things when the page loads. We want to do these things when the user clicks on specific elements. So if we go to the final project, we want something to happen when this specific button is clicked. So when we click this button, we want the menu to open. When we click this one, we want it to close. If we click the thumbnails of the gallery, we want this to be the image that is showing. Same for the third one. Right here, we also have an example. When we select paid, we want only the paid products to be shown here. If we click the free one, we want only the free ones to show. And the facts also have something similar. So when we click here, we want to open or close it. So everything is going to be triggered by clicks. There are other events in JavaScript, but for now, we're going to focus on the click one. And the name of it is onClick. So how do we start listening to an event on a specific element? And how do we define what's going to be done when that event occurs? So the method to select the element is going to start exactly the same way. So let's continue to use this element as an example, and then we can change to the menu button. So here document.querySelector. So we select that element, and now instead of going straight to the class list, we're going to add an event listener. So we can type add event, and then we have it in the list. Again, so you don't make a mistake with the capital letters, it's always good to select it from the list like I just did. Open and close parentheses, and now we're gonna have to start paying attention because functions can have multiple arguments, and the arguments are going to be separated by commas, as you can see right here. For this one, the first argument that this function is going to take is the name of the event that we want to track. So the name of it is click. This is going to be the first argument. So we are going to add a comma, and the second argument of this function is going to be what we want to do when that event occurs. And for that, we need to create a function. Again, don't worry too much about this. I know this may start being a bit more complicated than what we've seen so far, but we're going to practice this a few times, and this is going to become intuitive to you. So what we need to do here is creating a function inside the parentheses. So here we start a function. This time we don't need to name it because we don't want to use it later. We are just creating this function to be executed inside here. So we can open and close parentheses, we can open and close curly braces, and inside here, we are going to write the statements that will be executed. So what we are doing here, just to recap, we are selecting this element, which is this paragraph. Then we are adding an event listener to it, which is the click one, and we are defining what's going to happen when this event occurs. And here we create a function because with a function, we can write multiple statements. We can add as many statements as we want inside here, and all this code is going to be executed when this event occurs. In order to test this, let's just do something very simple, which is using the alert function. We open and close parentheses, and we pass a message like P element clicked. Then we press enter, and we just assigned this event listener to that paragraph. So now every time we click here, our function is going to be executed. We can press OK. If we click it again, it's going to keep listening to this event. Now let's write this in our JavaScript file, and when we start breaking lines, this is going to seem less complicated. But instead of doing this to the P, let's actually start working with the menu button, which is the one that we want to work with. So let's select it to see if it has a specific ID. So here's the button. It has an ID of Open Nav Menu. So this is the element we're going to work with. Now let's go to our JavaScript file, and finally what we're going to start typing here right now, it's not just for testing, this is actually the functionality that we need to build for our project to work. So let's start with document.querySelector, and then we're going to select an element that has this ID. Once we select this element, we're going to add an event listener to this element. Now open and close parentheses and add the semicolon. Now remember that this method is going to take two arguments. The first argument is the event that we want to listen to, and the event we want to listen to in this case is called click. Now the second argument is what we want to execute. So for this, we are going to start a function. So function, open and close parentheses, open and close curly braces. And now we can break the line, and inside here we can write as many statements as we want, and all of these statements are going to be executed when this event occurs. Again, if this syntax is confusing you right now, trust me, with time, with practice, this is gonna seem very intuitive to you. So just press Ctrl Z so we can see this better. We have the first argument, which is the name of the event. Then the second argument is the function that we want to be executed. And inside curly braces is where we're going to type all the statements we want. So here we can break the line so we can see the statements better. Now to test if this is working, let's start with an alert. I always like to do this because then before we start typing too many things and manipulating CSS and styles, we can first check if the event listener is working. If not, then we can first see what's wrong before we continue. So let's see if the alert is working. We can type anything here like menu, button clicked, save this. And when we go back there, if we click this button, we can see that the event listener is working. Now, every time we load the page, so let's refresh the browser. Every time we load the page, the JavaScript engine is going to read these lines and is going to execute this block of code. So this is why every time we click this button, it is going to fire that function. And the only statement we have inside is just to send an alert. Now, of course, this is not what we want to do. We want to manipulate CSS classes so we can show and hide the menu. Now that we learned how to add an event listener to this button and execute a block of code when this event occurs, let's create the functionality to open and close the menu. So here with the final project open in the web browser, let's understand how this works. So I'm just going to hit F12 or right click and go to inspect so we can see the elements. When I click this button, this element appears. If I select this element, which is the one with a class of wrapper, we can see that it has a class of nav open. And when it has a class of nav open, it has the right property set to 0. So this is how I decided to make it work. This is not JavaScript. This is something that it's done before JavaScript, which is the decision of how these things are going to work. So this is a common way of solving this problem. We can have an element with the right property set to minus 100%, for example. So when it's set to minus 100%, the element is still there, but we can't see it because it has minus 100% on the right property. When we change it to 0, then we can see the element. And we are doing that with the class. So if we go back to our project, let's go to the main. Let me erase this. We're not going to need this anymore. And I'm going to search for nav open. So as you can see, this is how I'm making this work. When that element has a class of nav open, I'm going to change the right property so that element starts showing. And once I have this done on the HTML and CSS level, with JavaScript, the only thing I have to do is adding or removing this class. And this is something that we know it's very easy to do. So here, let's copy the selector so we can use. Let's go to the JavaScript file. And when we have that event occurring, what we are going to do is we're going to select that element. So we can use again the query selector. Now the element we want to select is header, nav, and then the element that has a class of wrapper. That's the one that we want to add the class nav open. So we can just cut it from here, and we are going to access the class list property, and we are going to add the class of navOpen. So once we click the Open Nav menu, we are going to select that element that should receive that class, and we are going to add the navOpen class, which is the one that will change the property and make it show. Let's save this. Let's go back to the page. This is the initial version. When we click the button, now we are showing that element, which is really cool. But when we click this button, nothing is happening. And why is that? Because we only set the event to this specific element. Now, the only thing we have to do is the same thing for the close button. So let's select the close button to see if it has a specific ID. So the ID of this button is close nav menu. We can do the same thing for this. So right here, let's just paste it here so we can save. We can copy the same structure. So this time, instead of setting the listener to the open nav menu, the listener is going to be to the close nav menu. And when we click the close nav menu, what we want to do is not add the class to the wrapper, but it's the opposite. We want to remove the class from that element. So we can save this. And when we go back there, when we click, we're going to open the menu. When we close, we are going to make it disappear. And if we check on the wrapper, we can see exactly what is going on. So when we click this button, it is adding the navOpen class. When we click the close button, it is removing the navOpen class. So it seems complicated when you don't know how it works, but now you know how easy is this. First, we make a decision on the HTML and CSS level. How do we show and hide the element? So we create a specific class for that. And then the JavaScript part is actually very simple. We can just add an event listener to the button. When the event occurs, we select the wrapper and we add the class of navOpen. When this button is clicked, we select the wrapper and we remove the class of navOpen. So as you will see later in the course, most of the things we do in JavaScript, they go around selecting elements and changing the content and manipulating their CSS. In this lesson, we will speak about variables. Variables are names that we use to store values. So let's say a customer enters our website and we have a form asking for the customer's name. We can store that in a variable so we can use later. I'm going to give you another example. Let's say we want to do conversions between US dollars and euros. So we could search for the exchange rate. So USD to euro exchange rate, and we can see that it's 0.92. So let's get this. And now we want to start converting some values from US dollars to euros. So for example, $450, how much is that in euros? I can do times 0.92. So $450 equals 414 euros. Now I want to convert $900. So I could just do this and type the exchange rate again. But why do I need to repeat the exchange rate? It's much easier if we can store it in a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called exchange rate, and I'm going to use the equal sign to assign a value to this variable, which in this case is going to be 0.92. So after we do this, every time we call this variable, so let's call it by the name like this, JavaScript is going to return its value, which is 0.92. So now we have this value stored under a name, and we can use it whenever we want in our application. So in the above example, we could do 450 times, instead of typing the exchange rate ourselves, we can just do times exchange rate. And now we have the conversion. If we want the other value, we can do the same thing. And then we have the value in USD. And now the beauty of it is that, let's say we are using the exchange rate in multiple locations in our application. Then the exchange rate changes. All we have to do is change the value of the variable, and it is going to be updated everywhere in our application where we use this information. So for example, I could assign a different value to the exchange rate. So let's change it to 0.98. And now when we do those calculations, now we're going to have different values. To create variables within our application, we're going to need to add something which is the keyword for creating the variable. And the keywords that we have for that are var, let, and const. So let's start with var. We could create a variable called customer, and then we can assign a value. In the example I showed for the exchange rate, we assigned a number. Now I want to assign a piece of text. So for that, we need to use quotation marks. Remember that they can be double or single quotation marks. It doesn't make any difference. So I'm going to assign a value to this variable, John. Now, if I want to use that variable later, so let's say now I'm going to send this to the console, and I'm going to send the value that's stored inside that variable. I can save this, go back there, and when we refresh the page, we can see John. And now we can even start using this value to form messages. For example, we can concatenate pieces of text with the plus sign. So we could write something like, hello, then plus sign, the name of the customer. We save this, and then we have a message, hello, John. Now, if another customer enters our application, we don't have to change the message anymore. We just have to change the value of this variable to Sarah, for example. We save this, and now we have a different message showing in the console. Now, the problem with using the var keyword is that the var keyword creates a global variable. We're going to speak in more detail about variable scope, but what you need to have in mind is that when we have a global variable, it is available anywhere in the code, and that can cause conflict. I have a variable called customer that is global because I created with the var keyword, and if further down the code I use the same name, which is something that can happen if your application gets too big, it's possible that you will repeat some variable names, and if that happens, you may have a conflict. So in order to avoid these conflicts, it's better that we use the let keyword. This means that the variable will be available only inside that specific block of code. Here, it doesn't make any difference because the variable is not inside a block of code, but if we had it here, for example, and we create with the let keyword, that variable is not going to be available outside. So if outside I create another one and I change the customer name, for example, to Paul, this function is not going to be affected because this variable is only available inside this block of code. Just one important thing to mention is that functions, they work a bit differently because they have their local scope. So even if I create it with the var here, the variables will still be local. I'm just using this example so it's easier to understand. So when we speak about variable scope in more detail, you understand exactly when we will have a local scope and when we will have a global scope. The most important thing to remember is that we should only use the var keyword when we intentionally want to make that variable global. This is not going to happen a lot. I think in this whole project, I'm only going to use var 2 times. The rest of the times, we are either going to use let or the const keyword, which is the one I'm going to speak about right now. So there is another keyword that we can use for variables, which is called the const keyword. In terms of scoping, it works the same way as the let, so it is safe to use it because when we use the const, the variables won't be available outside that block of code, so we won't have conflict. So when to use let and when to use const. Basically, when you are not going to reassign a value to a variable, you should use const. So most of the times we're going to use const unless when we want to reassign the value of the variable. I think it's easier to understand this if we do an example. So let me just erase this before I forget. So let's use an example down here. Let's create that variable for the customer named Sarah. In this case, the customer just logged in, so I'm not going to replace that value. So for that, I'm going to use a constant. Now I'm going to create another one. Let's use constant for now, which is going to be Sarah's balance. So let's say Sarah is logging into her internet banking and she has a balance of $2,000. Remember that for numbers, we don't use the quotation marks. Now we can send a message to Sarah. So let's do console.log. Remember that console.log is only for the developers, not for the user, but we're going to do this just as an example, just so we can see the values of the variable. So we can do something like hi, and then we concatenate with the customer name, and then we concatenate with a period, and then we say your balance is USD, and then we concatenate with the balance. Let's save this and let's see what happens. So here, hi Sarah, your balance is $2,000. Now let's say Sarah is going to make a deposit of $200 in her account. In that case, we're going to have to reassign the value for the balance. We need to add the $200. So in this case, we can't use constant for that. A constant is only for variables that won't be reassigned. For example, a customer. When Sarah logs in, we won't have to change the value of that variable anymore. But for the balance, if Sarah makes a deposit or a payment or any transaction, we're going to need to reassign the value of the balance. So in this case, we are going to use let. Now that we have let, we can change the value of this variable. Now that we already created it, we don't use the keyword anymore. We just call it by the name like we did here. But we can say that the balance this time is going to be the balance. So the value we had before, which was 2,000 plus 200. Which was the deposit that Sarah made. And now we can do console.log and say, hi Sarah, your new balance is, and then we can reassign a value to this variable. We save this, go back to the page, and as you can see, hi Sarah, your balance is 2,000, and then she made the transaction and your new balance is 2,200. So again, don't worry about this too much. You will know the difference between let and const in a very intuitive way as we progress in the project. The main thing to remember is don't use var unless you intentionally want to make the variable global, which is going to be a rare thing. Most of the times we will either use constant or let. When the variable won't be reassigned like the customer name, we're going to use const. When the variable can be reassigned like the balance that we need to do calculations and change it, then we are going to use let. So these are the differences between the keywords to create variables. Now that we know how to create variables and the difference between the keywords var, let, and const, we need to speak about some naming rules and best practices. So let's start with naming rules. Variable names can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. So this means that we can't use special characters like asterisks or dashes, but we can use underscores and dollar signs. Names must begin with a letter, a dollar sign, or an underscore. So even though numbers are accepted, we can't start the variable names with numbers. We can only use numbers in the middle of the name. We must start either with a letter, an underscore, or a $sign. We're going to speak about best practices in a moment, so we are not going to use the $sign or the underscore that much. We're normally going to start with a letter. Names are case sensitive. We already spoke about how JavaScript is case sensitive, so if you create a variable called customer, all in lowercase, if you then try to call it with any letter in uppercase, it is not going to be recognized as the same variable. Reserved words cannot be used as names. We already covered this topic as well. So if we have that object called document, which is the one created for the DOM, we can't create a variable called document. This is going to cause a conflict. We also cannot use the keywords like let, const, var. We cannot create a variable called var because this is already a reserved word. And the same goes for the JavaScript built-in functions. So let's go back to the code and see these rules in action. Could we create a variable called customer1 or customer2? Yes, because we can use numbers. However, we can't start with numbers. So this is not going to be accepted. We can use numbers in the middle, but we can't use in the beginning of the variable. Can we start with an underscore or with a $sign? Yes, that's accepted as well. But to keep consistency, we are normally going to start with letters. Can we create a variable called customer-name? No, we can't because we cannot use dashes for variable names. However, we can use underscores. So customer name with an underscore is fine, but customer-name is not accepted. Customer/name is also not accepted. So the only symbols allowed are underscores and $signs. Now let's speak about style. Can we create a variable with all uppercase called customer? Yes, we can, but I don't think it's a good practice to do it like this. I think it's better to keep lowercase and you need to decide your style. For example, when you have variables with multiple words, like the example I gave, which is customer name, you need to decide if throughout your application you are going to use underscores or a different method. For example, I could write customer name. And then if I want to have more or less the same name for the balance, I could use something like customer balance. This way I'm going to keep consistency. So if you prefer to use underscores to separate names, you can go ahead and do it. The pattern that is most widely used in JavaScript is called camel case. So we already seen some properties and some JavaScript functions that use that. For example, look at this add event listener. What happens here is that the first word is all in lowercase, and for all the subsequent words, the first letter is in uppercase. So in this example, the first word would be lowercase, and then the next words would start with an uppercase. So we could do the same thing for the balance. So here we have customer name, customer balance. This is a pattern that it's very common to see in JavaScript code, and it is called camel case. This is the one I prefer to use. So that's how I'm going to be naming variables throughout the project. But in your projects, if you want to use the underscore instead and do it like this, it's fine as well, as long as you keep consistency. So don't start with underscore and then change to camel case. It's better that you choose one of them and just stick to it. Now, just one last thing I want to speak about variable names is that they have to be meaningful. So I'm not going to create a variable called A for the customer and called B for the balance, right? Because this code is going to be very difficult to maintain. When we look at the code, it's going to be hard to know the intention of the programmer when this was created. So the name should always be meaningful. So the ones we had before were good because here we know that this is the customer name, this is the balance. It's easy to understand what this code is going to do. Another thing is try to keep short. So I'm not going to create a variable called this is the customer name. This is unnecessarily big. For this one, I think even just customer would be enough, unless we had different information like account number or any other information from the customer. So we would have customer name, customer ID, and these kinds of things. But here for this example, customer is a perfect name for this variable. We know what this is about. It's short, it's meaningful, so it's a good one. The same goes for this. So if this is a small application that only does this, it's fine to use customer and balance. So try to keep the names short but meaningful. And these are the rules and best practices for variable names. Now that we know how to create variables and what we use them for, we need to speak about something important, which are data types. Every time we assign a value to a variable, they will have a data type. And why is that important? Let me give you one example. I can create a variable called num1 and I can assign a value to it. Let's say 12. Then I'm going to create another variable called num2. Remember that we can use numbers on variable names as long as they are not the first character. So the second number is going to be 14. If we want to know the type of the variable, we can use the type of operator. So we just write type of, and then we write the variable that we want to check the type. We press enter, and we can see that it's a number. And why is it important to know the type of a variable? That's because operators are going to behave differently depending on the data type. So for example, if we want to sum the two numbers, we could do num1 plus num2. And we know that the plus sign will do the addition when we are working with numbers. But this time, what if we had it like this? So num1, and I'm going to type 12 inside quotation marks. I'm going to do the same thing for num2. So num2 this time is going to be 14 inside quotation marks. Now what's going to happen when we do num1 plus num2? Now we have a complete different thing because this is now a string. So if we do type of num1, we can see that this variable is not a number anymore. This is a string, and the plus sign, when we are working with strings, it does not do the addition. The plus sign does the concatenation. So what we did was getting 12 and putting side by side with 14, and we concatenated into 12, 14. This is what the plus sign does with strings. So this is why it's important to know the data types so we don't have unexpected behaviors in our code. One thing to be aware of is that JavaScript is a weakly typed language. So it means that JavaScript can recognize the different data types, but it is not very strict about that. So here we created variables for numbers, and then we reassigned the values for them, this time using strings, and JavaScript didn't do anything, didn't complain, didn't generate any error. The same way that if we have num1 as a number, so let's try num1, 10. Now we have a number, and let's assign a string to num2. So num2 is going to be 2 inside quotation marks. If we try to do num1 plus num2, JavaScript is going to try to fix the problem for us. So in this operation, JavaScript made the decision to transform the first one into a string and do the concatenation. Although this seems like a good thing, this is exactly the opposite. We don't want JavaScript to be making those decisions because this is going to lead to unexpected results. This is why we always need to pay attention to the data types so we make sure that the operations we do will behave in the expected way. In other languages that are strongly typed, like Java or C#, we would have errors when we try to change the type of a variable or when we try to do an operation with different data types like this. This is not the case for JavaScript. JavaScript is a more flexible language, but like I'm showing you right now, we need to pay attention so we don't produce wrong values. Let's start speaking about the data types in more detail, and the first one we are going to cover are strings. So I'm going to create a new variable called account number, and I'm going to assign a string to it. Now, one thing important to mention is that you should only use numbers when you want to do calculations with the number. So for example, you want a variable to do sum, subtraction, or any type of calculation, then you can use a number. But in the case of an account number, even if the account number is numeric only, we should use strings because this is not a number that we will have to do any calculation with it. But in the case of the account number, let's also add a character in the beginning. So let's say national customers, they have an account number starting with an N, and international customers, they have an account number starting with Y. So this is the account number of a customer that just joined our website. Now, one thing important to notice about strings is that they are considered as a sequence of characters. So a string is actually a sequence of multiple characters. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters. If you want to get the length of a string, you can just type the name of the variable and then you can access the property called length. This is a property available for some data types and string is one of them. So if you try to access this property, JavaScript is going to return 7, which is the number of characters in this string. This information could be useful, for example, if we had to validate the account number. So let's say account numbers can only have 7 digits. So we could test if the account number given by a customer has 7 digits before we try to look it up in the database. So we could use it for validation. Another important thing is that each character has its position inside the string. So this one is the first character and the indexes start at 0. So this one has an index of 0 and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How do we know the first character of a string? We can call the variable name and then we are going to use braces and then we can type specific indexes. So if we want to get the first character of a string, we could search for index 0. So the first character of this string is I. And this information could be useful to let our system know that this is an international customer. If the account number was different, starting with an N, for example, for national customers, when we get the first character, we would get N and we would know that this customer is a national customer. Now let's change the account number a bit and let's say the first 2 characters represent the country. So if I have PT for the first 2 characters, that means Portugal. If I have ES, that's Spain, and so on. So to define what country is this customer from, we would have to get the first 2 characters of the account number. this is something that it's easy to do. We have some methods that we can use with strings. So in this case, we could do account number dot slice, and then we can let JavaScript know what characters we want. So we want to start on index 0, and we want to stop at index 2. So start on index 0 and stop at index 2. So why is it index 2 and not index 1? This is because the slice method, the start index is included in the result, but the ending one is not included. So this is why you need to add one extra index. So here from 0 to 2, it will be from 0 included to 2 excluded. So in fact, it's going to be from 0 to 1. Once we do this, we can then extract only the first 2 digits, and we know that this customer is from Portugal. So this is something useful that we can do with strings. Now, another useful thing that we can do with strings is replacing parts of a string. So let's say for some reason we are receiving account numbers with an underscore, and we don't want to have that underscore. What we could do is use a method called replace. So we could do account number dot replace, and here first is the value that we want to replace. In this case, it's going to be the underscore, and the second value is going to be the one we want to replace it by. So if we want to replace the underscore for a dash, for example, we do this and we were able to replace it. If we just want to remove it, we can just use an empty pair of quotation marks. So if we add a space, we are going to add a space in the place of the underscore. If we have an empty string, then we are just going to remove the underscore. So if we do this, now we're going to have the account number without the underscore. Now pay attention, because if we try to get the value of account number, you will see that the value has not been replaced. So if you want to actually replace in the original variable, you would have to do account number equal sign, and then you are going to reassign the value. Then you are going to replace the underscore by an empty string, and now you have the account number updated. So these are just basic operations that we can do with strings. As we progress in the course, you will see that they are going to be useful on many occasions. I'm not going to go deeper into this, because if you want to know more operations that you can do with strings, you can just go to Google and type JavaScript string operations. And then I think W3 Schools is a good source of information. So here you are going to have many examples of different operations that you can do with strings, with examples. You can even click try it yourself, and then you can change the numbers and see the result. In this lesson, we will speak about the number data type. So for that, let's create a new variable called price, and let's assign a number. If we don't use the quotation marks, we are going to create this variable as a number. So we could type the price, for example, at 17. If you want to use decimal places, you should always use dot, not comma. So this is 17.55. Now, if we do the typeof operator in this variable, we can see that JavaScript considers this as a number. Some programming languages will do a distinction between integer, which would be 17, and float, which would be 17.55, but not JavaScript. For JavaScript, everything is number. And with numbers, we can do the basic math operations. So I've showed you a few times how to do simple operations like 2 plus 10. We can also use subtraction, so 10 plus 4, or even better, let's create another variable for a discount. And let's say we have a $2 discount. And then if we want to have the final price, we can do price minus discount. And here we have the final price. We can also make a division with the slash, so 10/5. Then we have the division, and the multiplication is with the asterisk. So 20 multiplied by 3 equals 60. Let me clear the console. You can also do expressions. So for example, if you have num1, 8, and num2, 12. If you want to have the average of them, you can't do num1 plus num2 divided by 2. Because if we do that, what's happening here is that because of the hierarchy of math operations, it is doing the division first. So it is dividing 12 by 2, which is 6, and then 6 plus 8, 14, which is not the correct average. So to have the correct average, we would have to close parentheses for the sum, and this way we make sure that the sum is done first. So 8 plus 12, which is 20, divided by 2, 10. So this way we have the correct average. We can also do, for example, 2 by the power of 4, and for that we use double asterisks. So this is 2 by the power of 4, which is 16. And we can also round numbers. So let's create that price variable again. Let's say the price is 13.789, and we want to round this price. There is an object in JavaScript called math. So this is an object that has many different methods that we can use with numbers. And one of the methods is the round method. So when we do this and we put the price in here, we are going to obtain the rounded price. This is going to round the price automatically. If you want to round it up or round it down, you can also control that. So you can use the floor method. So this way you are going to round the price down. As you can see, it is going to be 13. And if you want to force the price to be rounded up, you can use the seal function. And this way it is going to be rounded to 14. It doesn't matter if it's 13.1. With this method, it is going to round always up. So in this case to 14. If you just want to round to a specific number of decimal places, you can just do price dot to fixed. And right here, you can define how many decimal places you want. In this case, if we type 1, it is going to round to 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places. If we omit, it is just going to round with no decimal places. So for prices, I think it's a good thing to round to 2 decimal places. Now, you must be asking yourself why sometimes we use like round and then we have the price inside parentheses, and why sometimes we have the price first and then dot to fixed, and here we have a different argument. This is because the round is a built-in JavaScript function. So it's an isolated function that we can call and pass the number as an argument. But the toFix is different. The toFix is a method that can be applied to values with a data type of number. I just wanted to mention that because this is a question that many students do. But again, as we progress in the course, this is something that will become intuitive to you. So sometimes we're going to use built-in functions in which they're going to come first. And sometimes we're going to use methods. So the variable name comes first, and then we use the method. One thing I want to show you before we move ahead, let's go back to that example where we had num1 as a string, so 4, and num2 as a number, so 8. We know that if we try to do an operation between a string and a number, we are going to have unexpected results. Maybe it's going to work the way we want, but maybe it's not. So we better that we control how this is going to behave. So every time you are working with values of different data types, it's always good that you convert the data types before you do the operations that you want. So in this case, if I want to do 4 plus 8 or num1 plus num2, it's better that I convert the data type of num1 to number. So in this case, I can use the parse float built-in function in which I can just pass as an argument the string that I want to convert to float. And this is going to convert the number. If the number has decimal places, even if it's a string, then JavaScript will create a number with decimal places. I'm going to show you that in a moment. So if we do this, now we have a number. Now, how do we make the sum of num1 plus num2? We could do parse float num1, and we could do the same thing for num2, even though it's not necessary because num2 is already a number. But if we are not sure what are the data types, a safe way to do this would be like that. So this way you make sure to convert the data type first, and then you can be sure that you are only working with two numbers. If you want to convert a number to a string, you could get num2, which right now is a number, and we could use the toString method. So when we do this, it gets num2 and it converts into a string. If we wanted to use this number for concatenation, for example, we would convert it to string. So now that we know a little bit more about data types and how to work with strings and numbers, we are ready to work on this greeting section. We now have enough information to work on the greeting area of our project. So here we have 4 pieces of dynamic information. The first is the time of day. So depending on the local time, we will show either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. So that's the first piece of dynamic information. Then we have how the weather is. So depending on what are the current conditions, we're going to show cloudy, windy, sunny, or whatever comes from the service that we are going to use for this. Then we have the name of the location, and we have the temperature. So 4 pieces of information here will be dynamic, and also we are going to create this functionality to convert from Celsius to Fahrenheit depending on the user's choice. We are going to do this in parts because to get this from an external service, we still need to learn a few more things. So for now, we're just going to create local variables and form the message. So it's going to be more or less dynamic, and later in the course, we are actually going to get this information from an external service. So let's go to our code. And before we move ahead, I want to introduce something to you called comments. So comments in programming languages are used to write something in the code that will be ignored by the interpreter. For example, if I wanted to leave a note for myself or for other programmers that will work on this project, I could add a comment. Because if I just type something here like menu section, this is going to return an error because the JavaScript interpreter won't know what we're trying to do here. But if we use a comment that can be done with double forward slashes, then as you can see, it changes the color and the interpreter is not going to read this line. So comments are a good way of leaving notes so you can separate sections or even explain your functions to yourself in the future or for other programmers. So right now, let's add a comment so we know that this is the menu section. And now let's add another one for the greeting section. This is going to make things more organized. Now let's create the variables that we need to form the greeting. The first one is the greeting text. So we can create a constant for the greeting text. So let's call it greeting text. And this is going to be defined depending on the time of day. Since right now we don't have the time of day, we can just use good morning. And then when we speak about date and time, we can make this work. Now going back to the project, we also have the weather condition, the city, and the temperature. So let's create constants for all of these pieces of information. So weather condition. Now remember when we spoke about the best practices to name variables, if I just type condition, it might be a bit confusion for people that work on this project in the future. But if I use weather condition, then it's clear what this is about. So for this, let's just use sunny. Let's create another one for the location. So we can use user location. Again, all of this is going to be dynamic later, but let's do this in parts. So let's type New York this time. And for the temperature, I'm going to use a let instead. This is because if we switch that button between Celsius and Fahrenheit, I want to change the temperature. So I'm going to be reassigning the value for the temperature. This is why for this one, I'm going to use the let instead of the const. For the other ones, we're not going to change. Once the user loads the page, we will have the greeting text, we will have the weather condition, and the user location. These are not going to change. These are not going to be reassigned. But the temperature, after the page loads, we will be able to change the unit of measurement. So the temperature must be mutable. So let's use a let. And for this one, let's just add a number here. And I am going to add a long number so we can also practice those methods for numbers. Now let's create another variable, which is going to be the weather text, which is different from the greeting. Remember that the greeting is at the top, and we also need one for the weather text. Let's go back there to just copy this example, so then we can form our own. So I'm going to put this inside quotation marks. Here I'm just going to use the single quotation mark. Just be a bit careful here because in this case, remember I told you that you can use either double or single quotation marks. But since inside here we have a quotation mark already, so for this to work, you either include a backslash right here so you can escape this character, or you can just use double quotation marks around it and you can then safely use the single inside the string. Now that we have the variables in place, let's replace the dynamic values in our messages and send them to the HTML elements. We could just do concatenation, so we could close the string right here, for example, and then use the plus sign, and then we would change this cloudy to the weather condition variable like this. But this is going to get too complicated. Let me show you a better method using template literals. Let's paste the message here. And instead of using the quotation marks, we're going to use backticks. So this is a backtick and it is going to end with a backtick as well. And now that we use the backticks, we can use the $sign and curly braces to add variables in the middle of our string. So instead of using cloudy here, we can add $, curly braces, and then we just add a variable name in the middle of our string. So in this case, we can enter the weather condition. We can do the same thing for the location. So here it's the user location. And right here, we can use the temperature, converted into a string. If we do this and go back there, you can see that this is working the same way, but this is much easier to read now. And if we change anything here, so let's change this to Mumbai. Let's change the temperature to 35.78. We can save this, go back there, and now we are forming the dynamic message with our variables. Good stuff. Now the only thing that we need to do is send these values to the actual HTML elements. So this one, let's see what's the ID. So this one has the ID of greeting. So let's use the document. Then remember that we have the query selector method. Query selector. Then we can select an element that has the ID of greeting. And then we can change its inner HTML to the greeting text. Now let's do something similar, but this time this is going to be for the message, and this is the P with an ID of weather. So here we can type just the ID, or remember that these are CSS selectors, so we can also make sure that it's only applied to a P that has the ID of weather, in case by mistake we have another element with the ID of weather. So the inner HTML of this one is going to be the weather text. We save this, we go back to our page, and now we are having this information dynamic. So if we change the city again, and we change this to good afternoon, save this, when we go back there, then we have the information dynamic. If you want to round this number, since you are using the string interpolation, that's okay to keep this as a number. So instead, you can use the toFixed method right here, and you can round this to 1 decimal place, save this, and as you can see, now we have the temperature with only 1 decimal place. It doesn't matter if the variable had many more, like this, we are always going to show it with 1 decimal place. So this is pretty good for now. We made this section dynamic. Later in the course, we're going to get this information from an external service.